Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Power Switch, Power, People, and the Energy Transition. I'm Erin Baker, and it's a real pleasure to be here with so many colleagues and thinkers who have spent years grappling with the forces shaping our energy future. The deeper we look at this transition, the clearer it becomes that it's not only about how we replace fossil fuels with renewables, it's about power. Who has it, who doesn't, and how it's being redefined in a world shaped by accelerating climate impacts, deepening debt burdens, and intensifying competition for resources. Power runs through supply chains, labor markets, trade relationships, and the financial systems that determine which nations and communities bear the costs and which reap the benefits of change. As governments, financial institutions, and civil society navigate this shift, questions of justice, equity, and sovereignty loom large. This conversation, part of New America's Planetary Politics Initiative, invites us to view the energy transition through both a geopolitical and a human lens. I'm delighted to be joined by three remarkable panelists who bring deep expertise from across regions and sectors. Dr. Alvin Kamba, a critical minerals specialist at Associated Universities Incorporated, is with us today, as is Dr. Elizabeth DeLostis, an executive in residence at the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability, and Laura Weisvish, a senior researcher at Igarape Institute. To start us off, I'll invite each of you, or three panelists, to share a brief line or two about their current research and how it connects to themes of power and justice in the energy transition. Let's begin with Alvin, then Elizabeth, and Laura.
Well, Aaron, thanks for having me, and that's a great introduction. So my paper is about, or what I've been working on, is how foreign capital reshapes political power in the global South. When we think about industrialization or Chinese money, sometimes it's all about supply chains, expansion of capacities, but it's also about the re-centralization and changing forms of like political power that occurs domestically.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I will be talking about some of my work that really looks at the nexus between debt and climate impacts. A lot of the countries that are most impacted by the climate change impacts, as well as the transition, are also the most vulnerable to becoming highly indebted. And in the paper that we recently released, it really focuses on some of the new tools, financial tools to address that, particularly debt for nature swaps, which have been around for 40 years, but recently have developed a new approach that focuses on private sector debt. And we look especially at a case example from Belize.
It's wonderful to be here. It's a pleasure on behalf of the Igarape Institute to co-convene this series and this debate with New America. At the Igarape Institute, we are a Brazil-based think tank, and we have been researching and doing policy work around actually connecting local and global dynamics, thinking critically about the role of the Global South in multilateral processes. So the ways in which we come to the discussion, it's really to think about that kind of Global South piece in the global transition discussion and what it means, the keywords of fairness and justice from the Global South and through all the complexities and the plurality in this big umbrella as the South. Thanks for having me.
Thank you all for those introductions. It's clear that each of you approaches this energy transition from a distinct but deeply interconnected angle, from critical minerals and finance to debt, geopolitics, and governance. So let's dive in. We're watching the global energy transition unfold alongside a profound reshuffling of geopolitical and economic power. As traditional energy blocks are shifting, new alliances based on renewables are forming, and they're all seeking to shape the next phase of industrial development, particularly in the global South. So there's a real opportunity for resource exporting countries to move up the value chain from extraction to extraction and processing, and eventually, hopefully, to extraction, processing, and recycling. but doing so requires new investments in infrastructure, industrial capacity, and cross-border trade facilitation, raising big questions about finance, debt, and sovereignty. So, how do these emerging realignments shape who holds power in the energy transition? And what might it take to ensure this becomes a moment of shared prosperity rather than a new version of the resource curse? Who wants to weigh in first on this? Okay, I'm gonna have to pick one of you guys, I guess. um, Alvin, well, let's start then looking at sort of the work that you've been focusing on, the new investment flowing in and what that means, whether it's coming from China's Belt and Road or the European Green Deals, Gulf state funds. How can governments ensure that this next wave of infrastructure and industrial development strengthens rather than compromises economic sovereignty?
Yeah, so got it. This is so the way I approach this question, it's a macro level question of how states govern capital, not just how they attract it. And in the paper I've written, I've actually looked at Indonesia, what I've called the Jakarta model, as some sort of like successful downstreaming strategy that's been able to bring at least around $30 billion in terms of foreign investments in the country. And some people say it could exceed $100 billion, right? Now, while many leaders look at Indonesia as a successful case of like, okay, downstreaming of like upgrading, it's created hundreds of thousands of jobs, accelerated regional growth. It's also the same model that weaken oversight, where environmental reviews are often waived and local governments lose authority, and there's a lot of hidden social and ecological like costs. And in the paper I've written, there's at least around $2.7 billion of a very conservative amount of like cost that the model has created. Now, talking about how can governments sort of like limit this cost, how can governments do this? I have five quick sort of like strategies that I've thought about. I think, and this is drawing from the Indonesia case. I think number one, fund independent regulators, strengthen the environmental oversights of these countries, of these places. Indonesia did the other thing. They actually weakened it before investments came in. Number two, tie incentives to verify labor and environmental standards. Again, in the Indonesia case, it's the other way around. They weaken these things. Mandate technological and skills transfer as number three. Keep public equity stakes for transparency, make contracts, I would say, transparent. In Indonesia, again, it's super opaque. You can't even access it. It's something of a state secret in order for you to get at these like contracts. And finally, ring fence revenues in out for development, for equity, etc. And I think multilateral partners like Japan, the US, and the EU can participate in terms of, let's say, financing, enforcement capacity, not just infrastructure. In the end, for me, sovereignty today means the ability to set and enforce rules, not just to attract capital.
Alvin, I think that's really interesting. In your paper, you brought up some pretty clear examples of what's at stake. Can you kind of speak to a little of what happened when Indonesia weakened oversight, what it looked like on the ground?
We're talking about like increasing levels of cancer rates, of asthma, of water pollution, air pollution, of land grabs happening left and right, not for mining, not just for mining, but also for extraction. And it goes back to sort of like the model of sort of like how these industrial parks were created. They do give, I would say, factory level jobs to like workers, but still there's a lot of cost that occurs specifically, not just to the workers, but also the villagers who sort of live around the parks.
Yeah, so we see impact on climate, environment, and locals, like the human costs of this. I mean, I guess to you, Laura, what would it take to design an energy transition that actually redistributes opportunity, one that creates fair work, strengthens local value change, preserves climate and environment, and reflects the social and environmental justice dimensions at the heart of this shift?
That's an interesting question. Maybe the 1 million, the $1 billion question. But I think the way I see is that I'm connecting our conversations about the global energy transition, which is it's also a power transition. And to me, it's clear that it's not only about energy or power, it's also about the way we think about economy and politics. So geopolitically speaking, we're thinking about a global transition, but also multiple context-specific transitions, right? And in that sense, going from this global to the national really requires thinking about the national plans that are being crafted within each of these contexts. And those are very different. Different conditions, they're pre-existing conditions that they are needed for us to think about what justice and fairness mean in a particular local context. So, and when we have the global conversation about power and transition, we're thinking about the ways in which external actors can help, can support with finance, with technical assistance, national plans through things like country platforms, existing instruments in order to promote this inclusive governance at home. So just this is the first point. I really think that we need to connect the global conversation to the national conversations. They're very specific. The second point I want to make here is that there are always winners and losers of these transitions. This is happening at the global side. It's also happening at the national side. And thinking about this, thinking politically about the winners and losers is also very important for us in order to promote the fairness and the justice that we're seeking. So when we think about the transition, we are often obsessed with the carbon part of it. And that's interesting when Alvin brings the Indonesian example, because the impacts are way beyond the carbon accounts, right? And in that sense, in order to transit to Paris Agreement compatible new economies, we must place the social, the economic, and the environmental dimensions way beyond the carbon discussions. So taking this kind of country circumstances it's very important. Let me just give you an example, bringing back to Brazil, where where we are based and are more familiar with. If you think the Brazilian Amazon, which is the place that is hosting COP later this year, it's a place that's full of contradictions. On the one hand, is a place that is actually a site of clean energy in Brazil. It's producing clean energy to other industrial areas in the country, but it's also energy poor. So because this energy is not going to people in the Amazon, it's going elsewhere. And I think this is at the heart of the governance and just agreements that we're thinking about. Otherwise, we're going to generate what we call the sacrifice zones that are only, producing this carbon relevant solutions for the world while, bearing the impacts and the costs. So just to summarize my points is this conversation is both global and local. It really requires us to think economically about the loser, politically and economic about the losers and the winners. So in order to redistribute opportunities, as you were saying, we need to go into the context and country specific, the politics and the economic dynamics they're playing out.
And I think that's a really interesting point about the sacrifice zones and not wanting to leave places worse off, like leave places behind in the transition or worse off. I guess that's a question for Liz. I mean, what role can or should multilateral institutions or new financial arrangements, for that matter, private or public finance, play in making sure that the energy transition unfolds in a just way?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's sort of taking what Laura and Alvin have said in that in-country context and sort of zooming it up to, so who's going to pay and how are they going to be involved at an international level? And your initial question really focused on China, the EU, the US, the Belt and Road, et cetera, which are very much bilateral, or the EU case sort of still bilateral. Clearly, any involvement at that level is not going to be nearly enough money, pressure, involvement. And so multilaterals really have and will have a role in whatever form this transition takes, just or otherwise, any transition. And that can happen in a bunch of different ways. And at some level has been happening. The most obvious way is investments, providing loans, the World Bank, various MDBs, multilateral development banks, et cetera, and they have ramped up clean energy, other related, and climate adaptation as well, investments to these countries. Particularly the multilateral development banks have fairly strong safeguards in place that require a lot of the pieces that, say, Laura mentioned, are embedded when these different investments come through those sources. So that's sort of the most obvious place. The second is in supporting enabling conditions, and that's really the different, like the country platforms that Laura spoke, or all of the different pieces that often these multilateral institutions are best placed to do. And you have something like the Global Infrastructure Facility, which is housed at the World Bank, which can work with a project from the very highest upstream level of what are the policies and helping the government with planning, et cetera, all the way down to the financing and post-financial closure of a project. So that's another important place. But the last, in my mind, important place where these multilaterals get involved is trying to attract private sector financing, because at the end of the day, all of the bilateral, multilateral public financing still is not going to be enough. Even if everything went just the right way that everybody is trying to push it. And so there needs to be a role. And right now, one of the areas that seems to have a lot of attention is really through what's called credit enhancement, essentially using the strong financial status of these multilateral institutions and doing loan guarantees or risk insurance, different aspects that can help attract private sector financing for often pretty risky types of projects in critical minerals or elsewhere, because you have the backing of these institutions. Now, I'll just kind of wrap this up by saying, on one hand, there has been a movement towards MDBs in this direction. On the other hand, coming back to the geopolitics where you started all of this, the current administration in the US is not promoting multilateral development banks. And they are, say, for the World Bank and the IMF, the largest stakeholder. And in fact, I think about a week ago, as we're coming into the annual meetings of the IMF and World Bank, there was apparently a letter agreement that was put out that the World Bank should continue on its focus of climate financing. And the US, Saudi Arabia, Russia, I think Kuwait didn't sign on to it because they're opposed. So where we go is still to be determined, where we go with the multilaterals.
Thanks, Liz. And I think I'm going to keep you for the next question, because this leads right into, I mean, as you brought up, critical minerals, the irony being, of course, that the US, the Trump administration, we're prioritizing access to critical minerals, even if we're not prioritizing how we use them. But we're watching how this competition for critical minerals is reshaping global trade patterns and strategic alliances. So the biggest shift has been what's going on in the US. The Trump administration, I guess, like the Biden administration, has prioritized access to critical minerals through its investment and assistance strategies. But what is the impact of the new policies and practices on economic growth and resource dependency in resource-rich countries like that? I mean, how has this affected the geopolitical balance?
Great
That's a lot.
question. And I'll talk about some of the geopolitics and an example, and then I'll be eager to hear what Alvin has to say, because he's a real expert in this space. But I worked on lending and investments by governments, the US and otherwise, in infrastructure, so have had a different view of this. It is, if you read the newspaper this morning, you'll know that critical minerals is a big geopolitical hot topic these days. And as you said, the Trump administration didn't create this. The Biden administration was very focused on this. And in fact, the first Trump administration also saw this as important. So this is not something new, but what is different is perhaps the approach. And under the Biden administration, it really sort of leaned into sustainable infrastructure, things like not just critical minerals, but renewables, et cetera, through ultimately a program called PGI, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment. And that was really meant to help support countries to be able, especially middle and low income countries, to be able to develop infrastructure on things like critical minerals, but build them in a sustainable, low carbon, equitable manner. And a big part of this was encouraging investments through things like credit enhancements, which I spoke, and others, but also there was a piece of foreign assistance that comes along with it, often not coordinated, but USAID played a big role, and the State Department, through its diplomacy, it wasn't just financial investments. It had a whole suite of different activities. Now, fast forward, the new administration, I think their mantra is trade, not aid. And we all know what's happened to USAID and foreign assistance. And the question is, can you, with enough investments, get the outcome you're looking for without the other issues such as enabling conditions we spoke of? I'll just give one very, I think, pertinent example. The Lobito corridor is in southern Africa, and it is a big project that was US EU project started under the Biden administration to build a rail from the Democratic Republic of Congo to Zambia to the port in Angola, critical for trying to increase the efficiency and access to minerals, especially coming out of the DRC. And the Trump administration has doubled down on this. This is a multi-billion-dollar investment project that also tries to bring in private sector capital. And the Trump administration not only, and it was really the highlight, the marquee project of the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment under Biden. The Trump administration, of course, everyone was nervous, are they going to, because it was a Biden project, were they going to kill it? But no, they saw the value and they've doubled down and even increased investments in it. However, at the same time, the aid dollars, the other technical assistance support, a whole range of other assets to the DRC, to Rwanda, to Zambia, Angola have disappeared. And so there's a real question whether you can make this work. There's security concerns. There are a lot of corruption that is ongoing, and say a grant to Transparency International disappeared. So there's large criminal gangs that don't want this to happen because it's going to disrupt their payment. There are local truckers who are in the informal society who are beginning to develop protests. There are all sorts of other elements, and it's going to be an interesting case to see if just sort of brute force and money alone, and perhaps providing some, militias to help guard this new rail project, if that's enough, or whether you need other types of assistance to go along with a big project like this.
Thanks, Liz. I mean, I think that's a really big question that we tend to overlook. Is it enough just to have investment without ancillary support? I mean, I think that's what we're facing now. Alvin, I'm sure you have a lot to say on this area. You want to weigh in?
Oh, well, if this is about the difference between the two administration, I think Elizabeth's answer is great, but I'm just gonna weigh in quickly that both administrations see critical minerals as strategic, as really important, but they actually come from two completely different approaches. I think under the Biden administration, there's an emphasis on market coordination and private sector incentives using the Inflation Reduction Act, tax credits, and allied partnerships to expand clean energy, solar, manufacturing in the United States specifically, but the focus was all about mobilizing private investments and shaping global standards through alliances, right? When in Trump's strategy is reverse, I think it puts the US government directly inside the mineral economy, competing as a country, not just in the market. So what we see with the Trump administration is, apart from tariffs, you have ownership stakes, with the government taking ownership stakes in a couple of like mining companies. Public financing, you have the expanded and strengthened role of the Exim Bank and the DFC, far beyond, let's say, what US aid used to do and sort of other institutions in the United States, right? And many of these organizations have come to like fund American firms in investing not just in mining but processing overseas. Many of these things are in line with the Liberation Day tariffs and the BIS restrictions that are meant to weaken the Chinese supply chains. And the Exim Bank comes in to finance like US companies as I would say companies investing abroad, but also companies that end up exporting as exporters and tools of influence.
Makes sense. I think this also leads into some of the issue. A bigger issue is that obviously our priorities are shifting on a geopolitical angle. Like peace and security are giving way to new drivers of diplomacy over climate, energy, technology. Laura, I mean, to your mind, could this shared urgency around climate and technology open the door to new forms of cooperation, even amongst old competitors, and give actors like the EU and the UK, or China for that matter, to reset relationships with the global South?
I think we should be cautious about kind of overing, simplifying, or maybe getting that kind of yes or no kind of response. I mean, I would say partially it's not a question of whether it can forge new forms of cooperation. It's already forging new forms of cooperation. But these new forms are not necessarily empowering for so-called global South countries, or not all of them are. Uh, and if you unpack even more, as we were saying, if you go, unpack the state, you're going to see kind of, a inter-elite agreements that not necessarily benefit the people. So, I mean, the question is, there are new forms of cooperation that are being forged through the lenses of this new shifting, the shifting sands of geopolitics. They are generating, I would say, an acceleration of existing or already ongoing forms of corporations, even among southern countries. And you've mentioned China. This is not as if China was only coming, in between inverted commas, coming to the global South in the last 5 years only because of critical minerals, right? These things are and have been going on for very long. There is a kind of a decentralization or a post-multipolar, post-Western world that is in the making for a while. And I think what we are, I mean, facing right now, and I would say from a kind of a global South conversation, is that sometimes these agreements are either being forged by current leaders with their bilateral counterparts without a more deeper or inclusive engagement of other stakeholders. And that sense that there might be kind of elite capture in some cases, or just, less inclusive, fair, sustainable outcomes. And in other cases, I think the regions are not playing strategically. And I think this is true for Latin America, it's true for Africa, it's true for parts of Asia. When you negotiate the EU or China or the US for that matter, sometimes if you go in the block negotiation, right, the Latin American, South American countries that could offer some kind of, regional supply chain in order to negotiate better deals would be, they will be in a stronger position than to negotiate individually, only as, suppliers of raw materials or part of that chain. And I think, and going back to the enabling conditions that Elizabeth was saying, the regional coordination is one of these kind of enabling conditions, the regional coordination and pre-existing industrial capacity for that matter. You can only have that kind of bargain if you already, if that kind of regional coordination predates the new scramble for critical minerals. So yes, there are new collaborations. Some of them are quite interesting in terms of innovating, but others are really replicating what we've seen before. And I'm going to end here. I think there is a real danger of us not using the lesson learned from, I'm going to call it either traditional mining or extractive industries more broadly, because it's not as if we were, I mean, in a completely new world. Maybe the geopolitical component is in between inverted commas again, new, but they are really, I mean, there is policy innovation, there is learnings from um, both traditional mining and extractive industry more broadly that we should integrate in the way we think about critical minerals. Otherwise, we're going to repeat some of the shortcomings of the past, including, creating the sacrifice zones, generating new hierarchies, or replicating existing hierarchies.
Thanks, Laura, for reminding us that the energy transition isn't just about resources, but about actually reimagining power itself, how it's shared, how we want to envision in the future. I'd like to pause for a moment to open the floor to questions from the audience. We have a few minutes. Yeah, or Alvin, you said you wanted to answer this as well? Do you want to come in and then we can go to the audience? And this gives a moment for the audience to craft questions.
Yeah, that sounds good. Just very quickly, building on what Laura said, and it's interesting she brought up sacrifice zones. That is exactly what the paper was about, and actually, the academic paper was built on that. But when we think about foreign capital, and obviously the biggest for me in the past 10, 20 years has been the Chinese. You're talking about multi-billion-dollar projects, supply chains linked to each other. It's not just a question of like, okay, international relationships changing or elites are like being created or sort of reinforcing their power. It's for me a question of like changing the politics of the country. And when capital comes in the country, let's say as a form of, let's say, foreign investments, this generates new political opportunities and new patronage networks that are created in the countries themselves. Because projects then become instruments for rewarding allies, consolidating coalitions, and redistributing rent as well across like players in that political space. And that also leads into like actors being left out in the process, people who are left in the sacrifice zones, etc. And I'm going to plug in my book underway with Cornell University Press that is exactly about this, looking at Chinese money in Southeast Asia.
Thanks for that, Alvin. Do we have, oh, great. Elizabeth, actually, you wanted to weigh in too. And meanwhile, people in the audience, do feel free to text in questions in the chat if you have anything to raise to our panelists. And go ahead, Liz.
So just want to give sort of a different aspect to this same topic, and that is there are cases where there are these new alliances that can be very almost surprisingly powerful. And the one that jumps to my mind is the Bridgetown Initiative, which is the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, and various others have essentially joined forces of small island nations to really force a rethinking and push reforms to multilateral and international finance with an understanding of especially these small island nations, which are often very vulnerable to debt and to climate being low-lying. I added up, there's something like 73 million people who live on small island nations across the globe. That's less than 1% of the population. And yet these folks together are really punching above their weight to be able to sort of force changes in this international framework. So there are changes out there, and there are models to look at of how to form new alliances to move in this direction.
Thanks, Liz. We've got a couple of questions from the audience. This first one might be for all of you. How realistic is the just element of the just energy transition in the context of debt and trade dependencies? Liz, you want to start with that?
Did you say me?
Yeah, if you want.
How realistic? Well, I'll take on the debt piece, maybe not so much trade dependencies. It is, it's a pretty bad situation right now for some low-income countries. And I would say I won't get into the details. Read the paper that I put out, which I think is in your uh, in your chat. But the critical thing is there are new innovative models, and such as debt for nature swaps, debt for climate swaps, and there are tools such as performance-based sustainability bonds, et cetera. A lot of them really rely on private sector investment and things like credit enhancement, but they're mostly focused on middle income countries. The poorest of the poor really ultimately aren't going to have their debt resolved through these different market and private sector forces. It is going to require aid or complete debt restructuring, et cetera. And so the world and the multilateral financial institutions need to decide that particularly the really poorest countries and those often the most vulnerable, that they're going to help address this.
Thanks, Liz. Alvin or Laura, do you want to weigh in?
I thought I could perhaps answer a different question that it's coming as well in terms of
Yeah.
if you don't mind.
Yeah, just read it out loud so we know what it is.
Yeah. The question was, how are these conversations coming through in the global forum? And I think this is a very interesting moment for us to be thinking about what are the opportunity, the realistic opportunities right now to shift this needle at the global fora, and in which fora are we talking about? I'm thinking here about, both, as we know, the UN is coming through, that there is an interesting ongoing reform conversation, the UN 80, that is rethinking the role of the UN at a time when different states, including the champions of the UN system, are either backtracking or openly dismantling it. And so I think, building on what Elizabeth just said, I think there is a real opportunity for other actors to be heard. And these actors were not outside the conversation before. There's just a reshifting of who has the legitimacy to speak, and actually who has the political willingness right now to speak on some of those solutions and these issues. And the fact that we're seeing more and more southern voices, either from the big emerging economies or the small countries, the vulnerable countries, the heavily indebted countries, to come up with solutions. And sometimes they're not rebuilding the whole system. They just have the legitimacy of suggesting, proposing some of the solutions that really affect them. And so this kind of mind shifting of, if you want to be a champion in the global space, you don't need to solve the whole issue. Maybe you can just put forward a proposition that speaks to your own reality. So it's a position of modesty in a way. Vulnerable countries that Elizabeth was saying, the small islands countries, they're not trying to solve the whole thing. They speak with the authority of, we understand what it is to be climate vulnerable, to be heavily exposed to public debt. And by the way, we also have climate ambition. And this is our proposition for part of that puzzle. And I see, from the kind of forest countries, a similar endeavor happening, in terms of, proposing, putting forward a new facility for financing standing forests or tropical forest conservation. It's not going to solve the whole problem, but it's taking that one piece as well. And it speaks to that kind of ambition, leadership that is lacking. And perhaps it's just a more kind of optimistic say of the global. If you unpack the global and you think about different fora, you see spaces for innovation, for policy innovation, diplomatic innovation happening right now. And I just want to end with the BRICS, because I really think there is the expanded BRICS. They bring a new opportunity for this conversation. Not only because the expanded BRICS are now they represent a larger chunk of global population, but also global emissions, but also because there is ambition within the group. Different countries in different ways are leading on either the energy transition with technology or investment. I'm thinking about India, I'm thinking about China, I'm thinking about the Emirates, or the nature-based solutions, and I'm thinking about Brazil. or even they are experimenting with the country platforms that we've mentioned before. You know, South Africa was one of the first countries that thought about just transition from a global south perspective. Brazil has its own country platform that it's innovative because it brings the energy, but also the nature-based solution. So I really think that we have to look at these this complex puzzle of different actors, big and small, southern and northern, in order to see how this conversation is playing out at the global level as well.
Yeah, and I think we're going to start hearing a lot more of these voices at the upcoming COPs, well, COP 30 and COP 17 next year too. I think this is our moment where we should start wrapping up. I want to thank all of our panelists and to the audience for such thoughtful questions and some engaging conversations. Today's conversation makes clear that the energy transition is not only a technological or an economic shift, it's a test of global cooperation, of justice, of imagination, and how we navigate it will shape not just our energy future, but the balance of power for generations to come. I thank you all for your time and wish you a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining.